All right. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. It's very early in the morning if you're watching this on the live stream from the Western Hemisphere. But welcome. Welcome to this edition of IISD's Trade and Sustainability Hub. This one is held alongside the WTO's 13th Ministerial Conference here in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. My name is Alice Tipping, and I'm the Director of Trade and Sustainable Development at the IISD, and I'm your moderator for this opening plenary session. I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined by a good 80 or so people here in person. We have over 500 registered to come in person. I hope they don't all show up at the same time. But we have another 500 or 600 people registered to follow this online on the live stream. So if you are one of these people following us online, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. And we're really pleased that we're able to bring, as we do for every hub, a range of voices and a range of perspectives, giving civil society and those of us who sit outside government the chance to participate in important conversations about the future of trade policy. And that future, I have to say, is not looking terribly smooth. International cooperation is always difficult, and it's extremely difficult in times of increasing polarization, which is what we live through now. The last few years of trade policy, I think, have felt a bit like ongoing crisis management, and the forces that are pulling governments away from each other and away from cooperation have been persistent. But we know that cooperation, when it makes sense, does deliver better outcomes, and that many of the longer-term sustainability challenges we face cannot be met without international cooperation. So this high-level opening plenary is going to tackle what I think is essentially the central question of this hub. Can governments find their way back to cooperation on trade policy? We have a fantastic set of speakers to tackle this rather difficult question with. And first, we're absolutely delighted and very honoured to have a keynote address from Hélène Boudliger-Artieda, who is the State Secretary of the Swiss Secretariat for Economic Affairs. And I should say the State Secretary is also Switzerland's head of delegation to the ministerial, so she has 7 places to be at once, and we completely understand that she will need to leave us just after her keynote address for another commitment, so we're very grateful in advance for your time. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone here in the room and also connected to us virtually. I have to say it's an absolute honor and pleasure for me to be here, to share the stage with Pamela, which I do from time to time in different places of the world, and also lovely to meet Jane. And then, of course, a big thank you to Alice and Nathalie and the International Institute for Sustainable Development for organizing this. I'm really absolutely pleased to be here. You mentioned some of the challenges that we're facing. You know, as a Swiss, I was born after the world wars, which hit, of course, Europe in particular. And I have to say, I'm a child of the peace dividend in Europe. And now to be faced with war back on our continent, I have to say, I've never thought I would live to that day. But that's not the only thing. We're here to discuss trade and sustainability. And, you know, all of a sudden these words are floating around regional economic blocks, also a thing that we thought through trade, you know, we might be able to bring peace and growth to all 4 corners of this planet. And then stuff like reshoring or friendshoring and so on. I think that's really a new era. Unfortunately, I have to say, because Switzerland, as you can imagine, we have a small population. We're small in size, but we're a mid-sized economy. So we're quite worried, and I can imagine that you know, people who have similar responsibilities than I do in developing or LDCs countries must be even more worried. Imagine if we're worried. I can only think what is this doing to others. And I thought yesterday we had some conversations among the ministers and head of delegations, and this sort of new world which offers plenty of opportunity, but also, as I said, all these new words and news phenomena that we're facing with, not all is well. I think I'm, as you can imagine, as a representative of Switzerland, I'm in favor of trade. It needs to be sustainable. I think it's not even a discussion anymore. I think we can actually drop the sustainable, because it should be, when we think trade, it should be automatically and only sustainable, and of course three-dimensional, not just climate. I think that's a given. I don't think we have to discuss it. I understood that there was a lot of convergence in the room on that. But then how to do it, and that clearly we have to do things differently. And I also love that people said yesterday, in MC12 we managed to sort of keep the organization alive, and with Fish One managed to actually really create action in a positive way, but that's not enough. So this MC13 should be all about reforms. Now. It's easy to say we should do things differently. We will see if by the end of the week we do agree on solutions. You allow me to propose some of the solutions that Switzerland is working on, but we're also very much here to listen, because I think none of us should pretend that we know it all, and that we are the ones that do have the solution. For us, as I said, we're small in population, 9 million, but we're extremely an open economy, and we're export-oriented. So for us, multilateralism is the solution and remains the solution, although quite depressingly we note that some parts it's not working anymore. But for us, we will keep engaging very strongly, and we really want to keep this space of dialogue open, because for us, only in direct contact and when we talk to each other, we are able to find a solution. After all, trade is, although we can do this virtual session, but it's a peoples-to-peoples business, and I really think it's important that we rebuild trust as well, and have these interpersonal relations, despite, I have to say, the slow pace of multilateral negotiation, and while oceans are emptying, small steps as Fish One, as we call it, are big steps. Now you're going to probably laugh, because everybody's always laughing when I say it, but we were the first ones to ratify Fish One. I know you were going to laugh, but not that it was a particularly challenging thing for us to do, but we just wanted to really make sure that, we set things in motion. And I was pleased to hear, unfortunately, we didn't meet Dr. Ngosi's goal yesterday, but happy to see that we're at 70. And I understand that some of these things took a long time, so I think we're on a good move. And if you can influence in your countries, please influence that we really manage to get to the threshold, and that this can become a WTO policy. Again, we are trying to put, I'm not sure I can promise that we're going to be the number one in Fish 2, but it's definitely one of our goals. But then what I think, where I'm a bit more hopeful, is the fact that we're also very much starting to engage in plurilateral meetings, and at the plurilateral level, trying to sort of get a snowball system going in a positive way, that those that sort of we agree, small group of people, that then, we can get united behind it and see if we can attract others to join these plurilateral movements. One is the so-called ACTS, where I think we're 5 of us are really trying to see how we can agree on climate-friendly trade practices, favor the trade of goods and services which are needed in order to protect the climate. And, it's not an easy thing to do, but but we're going well. And then we're, of course, also heavily engaged in the negotiations under the Joint Statement Initiative on Investment Facilitation for Development, IFD. I attended the event. I thought there was good momentum. I hope that we can push for it to be agreed upon and added to Annex 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement. I understand that there are some blocking powers still in the room, but I was really encouraged on how many ministers actually showed up for IFD. So we're definitely going to be pushing for that. And then e-commerce, that's our big hope and our big priority. We believe that we absolutely have to extend the e-commerce moratorium. And we believe it's absolutely key. We're not talking because of self-interest. We really think we should avoid any erosion on what we have achieved in the past, and hope that we can continue with this e-moratorium. And e-commerce, of course, is an immense economic opportunity, not only for the likes of us, but also for developing countries, and in particular for small island developing states who are a long way from the markets. You know, easy for us to talk. We're located in the heart of Europe. We have some of the biggest markets around us. So we believe e-commerce is really an opportunity for those that are geographically speaking a bit further away from the large markets. So that's my few remarks. I hope I was concrete enough and not too depressing. No, it's really a challenge. And I thought it was compelling what ministry colleagues from the developing and LDC world told us both during opening and then during these ministerial conversations that we had. And Switzerland is willing to do its part and see that we can move the dial into the right direction. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry that I cannot stay for the whole segment.
Completely understood. No, thank you very much indeed, State Secretary. As you say, this is a people-to-people business, so go out there and build some trust. Thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful for your presence. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you. And speaking of people, I can now turn to introduce the three women, each leaders of organizations, in each organization deeply engaged in supporting trade and supporting trade policy. We have Pamela Coke-Hamilton, many of you will know her, the Executive Director of the International Trade Center based in Geneva, Jane Nalunga, the Executive Director of Seatini based in Uganda, and my own boss, Natalie Bernasconi, who's the Executive Director of IISD Europe based with me also in Geneva. So we have two questions to put to these women. And the first focuses really on the actual present context of why we are all here in Abu Dhabi today, and that, of course, is the WTO ministerial. So the first question we thought we would bring to them and to you is a question about what we can actually expect from MC13. And there have been many articles and many videos and many news articles written in the last week or so. But we'd like to ask them their opinions of what we can expect and what we cannot expect from MC13 in terms of cooperative outcomes. So we'll have a quick exchange on that question. And then the second question aims, I think, to situate us all here in Abu Dhabi in the broader context of what's going on trade and sustainable development. The WTO is important, but it is only one part of the broader world of trade and of trade policy. And there's a lot going on in that broader world. So we wanted to make sure we brought that context into this discussion today. So I might start perhaps with this first question, and I might start with you first, Pamela, if that's all right. What do you think we should be expecting from MC13? Go ahead, please.
Voila, thank you. First of all, let me thank IISD for having me here. And I'm thrilled to be on a panel with all women. I don't think I've ever been on a panel with all women. things are looking up, But I do want to say that I'm trying to choose my words carefully because, you just never know where things may end up nowadays. I think MC13, in my view, is a primer for MC14. And I say this because I'm a realist. That's just the way I think. The world is very clear. And so I think one of the key issues is, first of all, how are we priming the trade and environment discussions in the context of MC13? It's being discussed. They're in the margins. I think there was a TESD press conference this morning. So clearly there's a momentum building and there's a kind of synergy. I don't expect that will be an outcome from here. But what I do anticipate is that it's setting the stage for what is going to be a major consideration and issue in MC14. I think the same is true also in the context of the e-commerce moratorium and ensuring that can be extended. I think even if it will be discussed in MC14 in terms of whether it's going to be permanent or it has to be extended because it is so important for so many countries. And a lack of extension will have significant impact, especially on the smaller countries, on those who are less able to access markets. And we see it from our own experience working with small firms. Their ability to access and penetrate markets has been multiplied enormously, especially over the last 4 years since the pandemic, through e-commerce. And to take that away, I think would be, in a sense, a travesty. Now, I'm not making any commentary on those who may oppose it or who have concerns with it. I have no dog in that fight, let's put it that way. But from a purely developmental perspective, from the perspective of a small business who have survived through COVID and wish to continue to access new markets, especially using e-commerce platforms that we've done through Ecom Connect and many of our other programs, it is critical that there be a continuation, an extension of this moratorium. The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the overall systemic issues. We have green, we have digital, the incorporation of gender now. It's not in the language of MC13 or the WTO itself, but the fact that there are now established informal working groups on gender and also on MSMEs begins to tell you that hopefully by MC14 we will be able to incorporate text that actually, embeds these considerations of inclusion in a WTO context. And I think that's why I'm saying this is a primer, because there are a lot of things that are bubbling, as we say in Jamaica, just kind of, just there. But they probably won't be achieved here in this context for many reasons. There are 50 elections this year, 50. Covering half the world's population. So I kind of think, we may not necessarily get agreement on a lot of things here, but it is setting the stage for what is, I believe, will be a very consequential MC14 in terms of decisions to be made and where we want to go. So I'll just stop there, but those are just my initial thoughts on it. Thanks.
Very, very interesting, and helps us, I think, to remember that yes, we can focus on MC13 in the moment, but it is only number 13, and there will be many, many more ministerial conferences. So what are we building towards? That's a really interesting perspective. I might turn to you next, Natalie, perhaps to dive into a couple of specific topics that we as an institute are following very closely. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. I want to actually start with saying, of course, we're trying to predict the outcome, which is very difficult. And I think in the context of the WTO, it's even more difficult. It's difficult in any international negotiation. But at the WTO, you all know that we're not allowed into the room. And we don't see texts unless we have special relationships and for some reason see texts. So it's very different from where I was, for example, 3 months ago in Dubai at COP28 in the climate negotiations, where you are allowed into the room and you discuss texts in advance. So it's a bit different, and even for me that I'm not, the team at IISD is working very closely and does have access to text very often. But we have to run after the text as well. And yeah, it's a very different context. So that kind of puts us into a specific context that's a little different from other international negotiations. And one of the negotiations that we've been following at IISD is, of course, in relation to the fisheries. And we've already heard from the State Secretary. This is an important negotiation. And of course, with 35% of marine fish stock already considered overfished, it's clear that international action and cooperation is needed to address this problem. And prohibiting and reducing subsidies that lead to overfishing is, of course, one of the pathways to contribute to addressing this problem. And you all heard the WTO has already adopted, but not yet, it has not yet come into force, Fish 1, where at MC12, the members agreed to certain disciplines. Those disciplines are really the minimum that could be achieved at the time. And at the time, consensus was really reached only to prohibit subsidies in the worst cases of overfishing. So in case of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, in case of already overfished fish stocks, and in case of fishing in unregulated high seas. So very important, but also you can imagine that was what the members could agree upon then. And what is now outstanding is what they could not agree upon then. And so you can imagine this is a bit more complicated because now we're talking about subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing as a kind of preemptive measure where you're not already in the total red zone. And that prohibition is subject, so in the text that we have seen, to an exception allowing subsidies to continue when members can show that they apply fisheries management measures to keep stocks healthy. So you have the prohibition, and then you have exceptions. And you also have exceptions for developing countries. You do have measures, special and differential treatment, and where you have temporary or permanent exemptions. And the disciplines also prohibit subsidies to fishing beyond the subsidizing members' waters and introduce additional transparency and reporting requirements. And there are also many alternative approaches that have been proposed, but none of them have gained sufficient support. So now, what is to be expected? I don't think it will be smooth sailing. In particular, some developing country members really remain concerned that the current proposal is not stringent enough to meaningfully discipline the subsidies provided by those members with the biggest fishing fleets and those that provide the most subsidies. So we'll hear many more details about these negotiations during the hub in future sessions, and I encourage you to go. But what will be the outcome is still unclear. There will be compromises that will have to be made. And I think I probably used up the time, but the other point that I wanted to refer to, if I have the time, is a dispute settlement. And that, of course, is a very important topic for the World Trade Organization. We all know that the WTO dispute settlement system has been paralyzed or partially paralyzed and is in need of reform. An informal process is ongoing to develop a new set of rules that aims to unblock the impasse over the appellate body. And members mandated the WTO's at the last ministerial to conduct discussions with the view of having a fully functioning dispute settlement system accessible to all members by 2024. Okay. So members are currently working on a text that streamlines procedures and emphasizes alternative dispute settlement resolution, but doesn't fix the appellate body question. And so with several members wanting still a two-tier formal dispute settlement system, it seems really unclear where these talks will end up. And it's quite interesting for me to see the increased interest at the WTO for alternative dispute resolution options. Because at this time, in other areas, such as investment, certain types of arbitration are under greater scrutiny. And those communities actually are looking at options modeled on what the WTO dispute settlement body used to look like with the appellate system. So it's quite interesting. And yeah, so it's a bit difficult to predict what will come out, but we'll see.
Yeah, we will indeed. And if you are interested, particularly in the fisheries negotiations, you can stay in this room, in fact, because the next discussion, and stay on the live stream, because the next session will delve precisely into those negotiations. So it's going to be good. Jane, we've heard from Switzerland, we've heard from those of us based in Geneva, but the world can often look very, very different from different perspectives. What do all of these topics look like? What does the ministerial look like from your perspective when you're based in Uganda?
Thank you so much, Alice. And thanks also to IISD for creating this platform and also for inviting me. It's a great platform for us to be able to exchange ideas. I wanted to go back to the issue which Natalie has raised, that the outcomes are not clear. They are negotiations, but we have expectations. So I'm going to talk about my expectations from Uganda, from Africa, and from LDCs. Our expectations are based on the context where we are, the challenges we are facing. Today, Africa is facing so many challenges, so many challenges, unprecedented challenges brought about by the COVID, the spillover from the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, the debt. We are indebted, very, very indebted. Most countries are indebted. But this is also building on to the already existing systemic challenges. So we are facing a number of economic challenges, economic and social challenges. And these challenges are also affecting the most vulnerable, the rural farmers, especially the women, the MSMEs. Pamela, you should know that about the MSMEs who can't trade, who can't access markets, the youth, the fisher folks. So that's the context we are looking at, that most African countries will not achieve the SDGs. That's where we are. And for me, I believe trade can play a key role. Trade is a powerful tool for us to be able to promote industrialization, promote structural transformation, be able to create jobs, be able to promote backward and forward linkages between agriculture, fisheries, industry, and trade. And those are our aspirations. And because of those aspirations, there are a number of initiatives on the continent. For example, the Continental Free Trade Area. But we're also looking at the WTO to be able to do certain things to make trade right for Africa. And there are so many expectations, but one, it's on agriculture. Agriculture is the mainstay of our economy. And for many African countries, when you put agriculture right, then the economy can be able to grow. And how do you put agriculture right? Ensuring that there is increased production and productivity, there is value addition, industrialization, there is trade in value-added products. Because today, most African countries are commodity export dependent. We export raw commodities, cotton, coffee, tea, and all that. So when it comes to agriculture, our expectations here, there are long-standing issues which have been on the table for a long time. Issues around the special safeguard mechanism, this issue has been on the table for a long time. A special safeguard mechanism will help us to be able to address import surges, which we don't have at the moment. This issue has been on the table when we were in the Nairobi Ministerial. It was almost like a done deal. And maybe these are issues which we need to talk about when it comes to the way decisions are made in the WTO. It's like we are going one step forward, two steps backward, because we thought a special safeguard mechanism would be a done deal, but it isn't. It isn't. And how is it important? I just want to give you an example. Some time back, there was a surge of imports from the European Union of chicken parts. Chicken parts flooded West Africa, and the poultry industry was completely wiped out. The poultry industry was wiped out, but also the maize production, because maize feeds into the poultry sector. So those are the challenges which we want to address. So we need the special safeguard mechanism, and it's an issue of equity, because developed countries already have a safeguard mechanism which they can fall back on. Because of a number of issues, we didn't tarify, we don't have, as developing countries, a safeguard mechanism. So that's one, we need that. There is also an issue of a public stock holding for food security. It's also important. We need a permanent solution. I can give you an example. During COVID, the COVID pandemic, a number of governments were able to give food to their people because they had been able to stockhold some food. So we need a permanent solution for that. Another issue which I want to talk about, my expectations, is the issue of the WTO reforms. We need to look at what kind of reforms are we talking about. Our expectations is that these reforms should address the current imbalances in the system, in the multilateral system, because there are so many imbalances, Another issue which the reform should address is the issue of flexibilities. Developing countries need flexibilities to be able to put in place policies that address their challenges. That's very critical. Another issue which is very important is the issue of policy space. We need, developing countries, we need policy space. So for all the areas of negotiations, let there be policy space. For example, on the issue of investment facilitation, it should address the challenges that are on the ground. And what are the challenges on the ground? It's the imbalances between the rights of the investors and the rights of our governments. Today, investors have a lot of rights. They go where they want, they do what they want. And that's why in the UN, maybe we'll talk about that in the second discussion, segment of that discussion. That's why there is a UN business and human rights. So those are issues which we are also looking at here to be addressed, that investors, that rights and obligations of investors and the state should be balanced up. So, and that the state has a right to regulate. So those are the flexibilities, the policy space which we want to look at. And lastly, on the issue of inclusivity, the way decisions are made. Because the WTO, when you look at the Marrakesh Agreement, it was about consensus, about inclusivity. And I hope that we also continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Yes. Absolutely, thank you. And I think between the three of you, you've put your finger really on the highlight issues that are going to come up this week, the very difficult highlight issues that are going to come up, including, as I think you've all spoken about, how do we set the agenda for the WTO? How do governments want to use the organization? Is it plurilateral? Is it only multilateral? How do we tackle environment? How do we tackle inclusivity? And at least those two issues are on the agenda. What we get now and what it leads towards is perhaps the question. But let's maybe raise our eyes slightly and think about what's going on in the rest of the trade policy world, because this, of course, is only one small part of it. And perhaps I'll start with you again, Pamela, if you don't mind. Can you give us a few thoughts about how you see the outcomes, lack of outcomes this week in the broader context of developments on trade and sustainable development? And then perhaps I'll turn to you next, Jane, and then you at the end, Natalie, if that's okay. Pamela, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you thanks. I was reading my notes and then I was saying, no, I'm not going to say that. I think they're tired of me not doing what they tell me to do. No, I think when we look at the broader framework of where trade and development is right now, I mean, just to date myself, 30 years ago, 30 years ago, I came 34 years ago. My first posting was in Geneva during the Uruguay round negotiations. And a lot of people don't remember this. It's not even on the wall in the GATT, in the pictures that they have. The 1990 Brussels Ministerial. How many people remember that there was a 1990 Brussels Ministerial? It's not even on the wall. They've just pretended that it didn't exist. It was a disaster of epic proportions. We all just walked around. It was lovely because we walked around, but there was nothing because they couldn't agree on the very basic of what the new multilateral agenda for trade would look like. Needless to say, 4 years later, we managed to come up with something. And I want to make this point because the fact is that there are always challenges to multilateralism. There are always going to be challenges to how agreements come about because everybody has interests. And the point of the WTO and the multilateral trading system as a whole is how do you ensure that the interests that are most germane to the most people are addressed? That is the critical element. And I think one of the challenges that the WTO is now facing, and in essence the international trading arena, is that over the last 30 years, a lot of the world don't think that they've benefited. They don't see it. They don't feel it. And it is difficult to convince people that they should continue to support or be invested in a process that does not see them, that does not take account of their interests, that does not address the very real issues that are being felt. So let's take, for example, the systemic issues. There are broad systemic issues that both the WTO and other agencies that deal with trade need to address. One of them for me is the very clear linkage between commodity dependence and least developed country status. And nobody talks about it. There's a nice little thing in the UN where there's a nice declaration and everybody talks about it's important and everybody says we commit and we endeavor and we, further commit. Sorry, I'm going to get fired. But the point I'm making is that we have a systemic problem. And the systemic problem is that the terms of trade have remained the same for the last 300 years. We have rules. We have new rules. We have, but the governance of trade hasn't changed. Commodity dependence is still the same as it was when we were exporting sugar 350 years ago. We send out raw commodities for the most part. There's no value addition. There is no ability to earn. There's no development of that country. There is no ability to increase their technology. No technology transfer takes place. We just go in, we extract, we move. The greatest producer of chocolate is who? Just saying. I've never seen a cocoa plant in Europe. I don't know. I mean, I'm just asking. And, the greatest producer of, all the mechanics for the electric car and so on is not Congo, but 70% of the cobalt comes from there. Coffee, I buy a Starbucks coffee today for $5. The Ethiopian coffee farmer gets 2 cents. So what I'm saying is nothing has fundamentally changed. And that is the problem. And if we are not brave enough to begin to dissect that, we are going to continue to have significant issues in terms of not just people's buy-in, but the growing resentment of a lot of, especially the younger populace, who do not see a future or a hope in this process. And so, in my view, one of the main areas that the WTO and other trade organizations, we need to begin to tie back in the rules with the reality. And how do we establish rules that also impact and change that reality? When we were there in 1992, I remember we discussed the whole issue of technology transfer and IP. And we saw what happened with the vaccines, and we saw how many countries were left high and dry because countries were hoarding the vaccines. And the rest of us weren't allowed to produce any. So guess what? You all die. What I'm saying is that there has to be something fundamentally missing in the context of a trade environment that does not produce equity and does not address the real needs of 3/4 of the world. So leading to that is the whole issue, for example, of the environment. There are rules. I remember also 30 years ago, the decision was taken that, we want to go into environment and trade. And of course, it was rejected soundly by the developing countries. Absolutely not. Because the way they saw it is that it was just another barrier to trade. Just another rule that they now have to meet in order to trade. Are their concerns legitimate? Is it still legitimate? And somebody needs to ask, well, if it is still legitimate, then what do we do to ensure that what they feared 30 years ago doesn't happen now? And so what I'm talking about is ensuring that there's a place at the table, that the voices are heard, that there's an engagement that allows countries and also MSMEs to be at the table to understand what do they need to do, how do they get financing to do it, and how do they get the time frame to be able to make the transition to the greening. Nobody's arguing whether the need for us to save the planet is legitimate. That's not an argument. The issue is, how do we do it with the least fallout? And that's where the conundrum is. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, you'll see in the agenda, one of the themes of this hub is trade and the natural environment. How do we allocate the burden of change? The change will have to happen, right? The question is, who changes, how fast, who pays, and how is that burden allocated? And if you're really interested, particularly in the question of deforestation, there is a session run by the ITC and partners just later today. So promotion for the hub, this is where you will hear about these topics. Jane, would you like to respond perhaps to some of the points Pamela's made? Because I think she's taking many of your points to a broader level. What else do you see in the context that we need to be aware of?
Thank you so much, Alice, and thanks so much, Pamela. The reality you have painted is not good, to put it mildly. Sometimes even we wonder where we can be able to start from, because sometimes when we come here, we forget that reality and we concentrate on the little things. What do we want from the special safeguard mechanism? What do we want? Yet the problem is really huge. And as Pamela, you have said, this is where we were, We're back. My country exports coffee, and what you have said has touched me, and small-scale producers are getting peanuts. And today, the European Union, because of climate change and net zero, they are putting directives on the small-scale producers, directives that you are deforesting, you are doing what, you have, then you say, really, we didn't cause this problem, but the spillover, are affecting the small-scale producers. And maybe those are also issues which we need to look at. The issues of unilateralism, because we all care, like Pamela, you have said, we care about Mother Earth, we care about this planet, but how do we address it? But the way it's being addressed, and these are, Alice, you are talking about coherence if we are talking about trade. Those are issues which we need to look at. EU has also put in place issues around carbon border adjustment mechanisms, without any discussions, So, we need to address that. But there are also issues around, how can I put it? The conditionalities that IMF World Bank is imposing on us. These are issues which are also counter even the flexibilities we do get here in the WTO. Because, for example, we have liberalized very extensively as a result of the IMF World Bank conditionalities. We reduced our tariffs. We privatized, because of those conditionalities. So it's important, Alice, like you were saying, the issue of policy coherence, looking at the broader context of trade and sustainable development, looking at all those other centers of power which are affecting trade in the region. Looking at, for example, other bilateral treaties. EU is imposing economic partnership agreements on a number of countries, breaking up regions. In my region, East Africa, we have a community, an economic community with tariffs, common external tariff, but EU is negotiating with just one country, Kenya. Then you wonder what's going to happen to our regional integration, So these are some of the coherences we need to look at, the broader context you are talking about, Alice, and how it's impacting on trade and sustainable development in our countries. Maybe I can stop there.
Super interesting, really, really interesting. And again, we will have sessions precisely on regional integration. In fact, there's one run right after this plenary in one of the smaller rooms. So I'm really pleased. The agenda, in the end, in the next 2 days, will cover many of this. Natalie, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to be quick so we can finish the live stream on time. But can you give us a sense, when you are an investment expert, many of this will be familiar to you, but can you give us a sense of how you see this part of our work fitting into the broader work that you're aware of, that perhaps we are so focused on the WTO we don't see it?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I would like to just maybe refer to 2 examples and come back to the subsidies agreement on fisheries. It's very interesting to think about this subsidies agreement as such, because on fisheries, because it's the first WTO agreement that has another objective at its core than, avoiding trade distortion. It's actually, the objective is an environmental objective. And now that we're going into phase 2, that remains the case. And I think that, we're talking about before whether this will be successful. I think the success depends exactly on the issues that Pamela and Jane referred to, because it's, in the end, it's not, there is very much agreement on the environmental objective. The problem is the equity issue. And you mentioned who carries the burden, but also those very big fishing fleets. How do you reverse that some can still grow and others may have to become a little smaller? So I think that ultimately the success of the WTO, I really have to say to the previous speakers, is all about equity. And if we don't get there, I don't think we'll be successful in anything. And if you want 1 minute.
We have 3 minutes.
Okay. I thought you would want to wrap it all up and have a little bit of time of that, but maybe just the plastics negotiation. There are actually, on subsidies, to say there are other areas where subsidies are being discussed, whether it's in the climate treaties, in the UNFCCC, and the G20 and the WTO on other environmentally harmful subsidies. So we need to assess whether and when these types of questions should be in the WTO. And the same question came up in the context of plastics, because you had a few countries wanting to discuss plastics in the WTO, but at the same time, UN negotiations started on plastics. And I think the role of the WTO is not zero. There's still something the WTO can do, including thinking about trade implications of what is happening at the UN, trade implications on developing countries. But it doesn't mean that everything has to go and be negotiated at the WTO. There is a role, and you have to find the right balance. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there, Alice.
Yeah. No, that's super, Natalie. And I think, essentially this plenary, I think, has done exactly what we wanted it to do, which is to introduce the really big topics that are on the trade policy agenda, not just those at the WTO. There's fisheries subsidies, the e-commerce discussions, investment facilitation, directly linked to the question of plurilaterals versus multilateral outcomes. And we've looked also, I think, a bit broader into the questions of other kinds of subsidies, of policy space, of how much governments want to commit to and how much space they want to leave themselves to regulate. And one thing I find very interesting is that the policy space discussion, narrative, perspective is actually coming from a very wide range of countries. It used to traditionally be something that developing countries would put on the table. It is now something we often hear large developed countries asking for. So maybe we have something we can agree on. But to be more serious about it, I think it speaks to a change of what governments want to cooperate on and therefore what they want to use the WTO for. Fine, all well and good. But to come back perhaps to the points Pamela was putting on the table, and which I think Jane and Natalie both echoed, the system is not going to work if it is inequitable. And again, the third theme of this hub is, what would a fairer system look like? Because at the end of the day, all of these questions, be it subsidies and industrial policy, be it the burden of change of protecting the environment, or be it making sure that the system delivers for people and for smaller coffee farmers as well as everybody else, comes back to this question of equity. I won't extend the plenary any longer. I know that, yes, there's a mysterious QR code on the back, which I was warned would appear. If you're on the live stream, you'll have it as well. We do want to know whether this hub, as you go forward, helps you to build the people-to-people connections and gives you interesting ideas. So let us know, and we can adjust as we go along. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Jane, for joining us. Thank you, Natalie. This has been really interesting, and I think has put on the table exactly what we'll be talking about for the next 2 days. Thank you all for joining, and have a good one.